Okay, welcome everyone. Today we're going to talk about, as you can see here, Matsuo Basho's, the Japanese poet, his collection of poetry, most sort of exemplary of his style, which is haiku and haibun, although we're going to touch upon many Japanese forms in today's lecture and next class's lecture. Yeah, so we're going to look at the narrow road to the deep north in other travel sketches, as you can see here, which would have been originally pronounced in the Japanese language, Okuno Hosamichi, which roughly does translate to the narrow road to the interior or to the deep north. So just to touch upon a bit of biography of Basho, he's a 17th century Japanese haiku master and was born Matsuo Konosuke near Kyoto, Japan, to a miner samurai as his father and his wife. Soon after the poet's birth, Japan closed its borders to the world, beginning a seclusion that allowed its native culture to flourish, which I think is very important if we think about Basho and his traveling throughout the interior of Japan, and really able to capture the fidelity of this closed off society, that we can sort of get a picture of how they interact and what daily activities they pursued. It's believed that Basho's siblings became farmers while Basho uh, was in the service of a lord's son, grew interested in literature. After the young lord's early death, Basho left the castle and moved to Kyoto, where he studied with Kijin, a distinguished local poet. During these early years, Basho studied Chinese poetry and Taoism, and soon began writing haiku no renga, which is a form of linked verse composed in collaboration. So it's collaborative poetry, and we're going to look at some examples of that today as well, and next class. Both in the tradition of renga, but also from Basho's collection of poetry, The Narrow Road to the Deep North. The opening verse of renga, known as haiku, is structured as three unrhymed lines of 5, 7, and 5 syllables, and that's something sort of to that needs to be underscored in today's lecture is the idea of haiku. And when we look at haibun, which is a combination of a haiku and a prose or just a paragraph, right? And renga and tanka is something we're looking at as well today. Is they have a form that they want to stick to. So, for example, a haiku wants to sort of be built around the 5-7-5 syllable structure, but sometimes poets break ranks. Even Basho sometimes breaks ranks with that structure of it. Um, in Basho's time, poets were beginning to take the haku's form as a template for composing small, standalone poems engaging natural imagery. So we're going to see that without a doubt within Basho's work, that idea of nature being accessed highly. This is a form that eventually became known as the haiku. Basho was a master of the form. If you remember from, if you ever experienced in the past a haiku, it almost always accesses some part of nature. So Basho published his haiku under several names, including Tasai or Green Peach, out of respect for the Chinese poet Li Po, whose name translates to white plum. Um, Basho's haikus were published in numerous anthologies, and he edited Kai-oi, or Seashell Game, and Minashiguri, or Shriveled Chestnuts, anthologies that also included selections of his own work within it. In the late 20s, in his late 20s, you got to remember, I mean, this is an old picture of Basho, an old sort of conceptualization of who he was. The guy was only in his late 40s when he died. But in his late 20s, Basho moved to Edo. Now it's a section of Tokyo, where he joined literary community. After a gift of Basho trees from one student in 1680, the poet began to write under the name Basho. So there you go. He adopted that pseudonym Basho. His work, rooted in observation of the natural world as well as in historical and literary concerns, engages themes of stillness and movement in a voice that is by turns self-questioning, wry, and oracle. So, in a lot of ways, we could think of Basho um, as a lyric poet, and by lyric, what we mean is he's exploring sound, um, and he's accessing nature. He's accessing things at some point, themes that are sort of he's grappling with how to sort of engage in the natural world, but he's also clearly accessing sound through he's sonically trying to engage the reader. Soon after, Basho began to study Zen Buddhism, a fire that destroyed much of his city. took his own house. Around 1682, Basho began the months-long journey. So here we go, this genesis of this collection, on foot that would become the material for a new poetic form he created called haibun. So haibun, as I briefly covered before, is a hybrid form alternating fragments of prose, so just a paragraph that you would write, right? That would be in an essay. You set up the haiku with a paragraph of prose, and we're going to look at an example later in this lecture. And then it follows, after the prose, a haiku to sort of trace that journey. Haibun imagery follows two paths. The external images observed en route, so what one sees as they're traveling, in this case what Basho would see and how you interpret it, and the internal images that move through travelers' minds during the journey. So blending of the external and the internal world. Maybe you might think of it as the micro and the macrocosms. He's created this new form of blending those two things. Basho composed several extended haibun sequences starting in 1684, including Nazarashi Kiko, or Travelogue of Weather-Beaten Bones. Interesting title. Oinoi Kabumi, or The Knapsack Notebook, and Sarashina Kiko, or Sarashina Travelogue. So always concerned, Basho seems to be, with the idea of engaging with the outside world by traversing through it. The most well-known haibun, Okoho Hoshimishi, or Narrow Road to the Interior, recounts the last long walk Basho completed with his disciple Sora. 1,200 miles covered over 5 months, beginning in May of 1689. While there, days were spent walking. In the evenings, they often socialized and wrote with students and friends who lived along their route. So that's where we get the renga that we're going to see as well, that collaborative poetry where you sit there and alternate per person each verse, each stanza. The route was also planned to include views that had previously been described by other poets. Basho alludes to their earlier poems in his own descriptions, weaving fragments of literary and historical conversations into his solitary journey. Basho revised his final haibun until shortly before his death in 1694. It was first published in 1702, and hundreds of editions had since been published in several languages. So the reason I chose Basho's collection of poetry, The Narrow Road to the Deep North, is one, it's a beautiful snapshot of this era of Japan, of when it secluded itself by closing itself off to the outside world, not trading with anybody, keeping the integrity of its language, keeping the integrity of its culture and heritage. So it's a great sort of look, a time machine that has great fidelity to that time that we can do it. But also, it was important as he was inventing new works. When he invented the haibun, right? Remember that prose paragraph followed by a haiku. He's inventing this new form, exploring both the interior and the exterior of this world. But he was also, we might want to think about the haibun too, is the extension of the entire collection, as we might think of this whole collection as a haibun. But also the haibun could be a singular poem. So we're going to explore the lyrical quality, the open space of his language, how he accesses nature, how he accesses the interior and the exterior of the world, the inner dwelling of the human in terms of them grappling with how to interpret the world, but also the actual imagery of the outside world. I think it's going to be important too. We're going to look at all the various forms that we just spoke about: haiku, haibun, renga, and tanka. But let's first talk about the idea of what the sort of the parenthetical title of this manuscript is, of his collection, is Other Travel Sketches, and what that exactly means. Okay, as you sit down to read Basho's collection of poetry, think about it through the lens of a travel sketches. This sort of this individual, this poet, traversing the landscape of Japan in the 17th century, and these observations he would have made. It reminds me a lot, and exactly what we see here, this image, this conceptualization of what Basho would have done, is just get on a horseback and then ride into the deep interior of Japan, experiencing different people, experiencing different parts of nature, which will become a sort of important part of the tapestry that is his collection of poetry. So it reminds me a lot of two things. One, the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, which is, as you would have known, if you read them in the past, is a collection of 24 stories uh, that sort of documents and follows a group of travelers on a pilgrimage from London to Canterbury. So, in a type of travel sketch, we receive the sights, sounds, imagery of those travelers much in the way Basho as he traverses across Japan's landscape. And that would have been a time capsule in and of itself for Geoffrey Chaucer's time, right? So between 1387 and the 1400s, when it was written, that idea of one, we get the time capsule of Middle English transforming into modern English. Uh, so we get that, and similar to Basho's time, we get that time capsule of both the Japanese heritage and culture, but also the sights and sounds. And there's a modern writer, travel writer, Bill Bryson. You might have heard of him. He's written two really good books. He's written a number of other books, but two really good travel books that I've read. One's called Mother Tongue, and he sort of documents the evolution of English, the English language, from Old English to Middle English to Modern English. Uh, Accesses colloquialism, so it sort of stands in as a time capsule of language. So we sort of is a is analogous to Basho and his time capsule of these travel sketches, right? And the other book by Bryson is In a Sunburned Country, where he travels to Australia and compares and contrasts to American and British lifestyle, right? And accesses the language again. It does an important drill down on language as a time capsule, and the sights and sounds of this country that is Australia, this continent country. So, like Basho, Bryson weaves in the storytelling and observations, the external landscape and the internal world, as we're going to see with haiku and haibun. So let's take a closer look at haiku and its poetic form. Okay, we briefly touched of what a haiku is, but let's explore haiku with greater detail. So the traditional Japanese haiku, as we see here with the two Basho poems, one on the left and one in the middle, consists of three phrases or stanzas that contain what's called a kuriji, or a cutting word. And this is made up of 17 what are called phonetic units. We call them syllables. For all intents and purposes for this class, we're going to refer to as syllables. But if you were to really sort of explore ancient Japanese haiku, we would just consider them units, phonetic units, so units of sound. So we see here these three poems, two by Basho, one by Richard Wright, which is a modern poem, a modern poet, that they're attempting to sort of stick to that 575 syllabic scheme, right? And each one is going to have to contain some sort of what the Japanese word would be kigo, or a seasonal reference, so that accessing of nature. So what I do when I sit down to sort of count the syllables to see how closely in the poet is sticking to the fidelity of the 575 syllabic scheme is just simply, there's many different ways. Everybody has their own way. I put tick marks on a paper as I'm reading, and to count the syllables, and I tally those up to see if it's sticking to the 575 syllabic scheme. Some people like to snap their fingers as to each syllable as they read. So develop your own sort of approach to how you want to sort of count syllables. So as we see here, this is one of Basho's most famous haikus that we see as an exemplar of his haiku writing, of his poetry. So an old silent pond, a frog jumps into the pond, splash, silence again. So that's 575. He sticks to it. Autumn moonlight, a worm digs silently into the chestnut. In the twilight rain, these brilliant hued hibiscus of lovely sunset. So he's sticking directly with the 575 rhyme scheme. Now, it's not, the collection we're reading is a translation, right? So that means that we're going to receive poems that were in Japanese. They might have stuck to the 575 syllabic rhyme scheme, but in being translated to English, it might have to break out of that scheme. And remember, too, as we see with Richard Wright, and we're going to see with other poets, the haiku doesn't have to stick to the framework anymore with regard to that syllabic scheme, the 575, right? It could break out of that, or just use it as a loose sort of framework. As we see with Richard, Richard Wright, his poem on the far right, is sticking to it pretty much. I think he has one where it's 6. From across the lake, so that's 6. Past the black winter trees, That is 7. Faint sounds of a flute. So he's trying to stick to the framework of the 575 rhyme scheme. So in so doing, many modern Western poets, such as Wright, in sort of breaking out of the strictness of the 575, even though he's sticking closely to it. It's not always the case with other poets when they access haiku in modern day. The Academy of American Poets recognize this evolution of not sticking to the 575 syllabic scheme, but maintains that several core principles remain woven into the tapestry of the modern haiku. That is, a haiku which still focuses on one brief moment in time, uh, employs provocative, colorful imagery, and provides a sudden moment of illumination. So, a moment where the speaker sort of understands something to the greater complexity of the world. So we get the nature imagery from across the lake with Wright's. We get the same thing with Basho's haikus. Wright's sticking with that Basho tradition of haiku, and the tradition that we move in with all haikus, and that is accessing nature in this and capturing this moment of time. Okay, so the second form, poetic form, that Basho was famous for, but also was the inventor of, was of course the haibun. So the haibun is a literary form, as we said, originated in Japan from Basho, combining prose and haiku, as we mentioned before. So that prose first paragraph will get set up for the poem, and then it springboards into the actual haiku. And again, the haiku, because of the translation and because of the adaptation in modern times, doesn't necessarily stick to the 575 syllabic scheme, right? Especially when we see the translation from Japan to English. The range of haibun is broad and frequently includes autobiography, which we definitely see with Basho. He's making observations about his own life. Um, Diary, so it's him sort of journaling his travels. Essay, we're going to see that as well. And the use of the prose poem. When we think of a prose poem, like I said before, just think about just when you read a novel, it's sort of, it doesn't rhyme. There's no rhyme scheme involved. It's narrative in nature. Um, and then of course, it's part of his haibun was of course his travel journal. His idea of this, as we see in the title of his collection, travel sketches, right? His observations he would make. So the haibun is always written in this way in first person. It's Basho, sort of interfacing with the outside world, and as we said before, exploring the internal landscape as well, right? Combining those two things, what the haibun does best. Basho's shorter haibuns include compositions devoted to travel, and others focusing on character sketches, landscape scenes, anecdotal vignettes. So just think about small prose is a vignette. Occasional writings written to honor a specific patron or event. He does that. He has allusions. He alludes to prior Japanese poets and even Chinese poets that he borrows from their language, borrows from uh, their various poems, and infuses them into his own haibuns. So traditional haibun typically took the form of a short description of a place, a person or object. And certainly we see that with Basho, or a diary or journal or other series of events in the poet's life, and we definitely see that. And I'm just going to read straight from the book, one of Basho's haibuns. It's on page, if you have the same book as me, it's on page 98. And the book I have is the Penguin Classics edition. So page 98. So he starts off with this. Let's as I read this, let's try to sort of parse from it where he's sort of expressing himself of the internal feelings, grappling with internal turmoil of some sort and tumult, and then when he enters the area of external, where the external observations of the world around him. So we start off with the prose paragraph. And he sort of, this sets up and contextualizes everything that the haiku is going to attempt to do after the prose, right? And the collection of two being the haibun. It was early on the morning of March the 27th that I took to the road. There was a darkness lingering in the sky, and the moon was still visible, though gradually thinning away. The faint shadow of Mount Fuji and the cherry blossoms of Uno and Yanaka were bidding me a last farewell. My friends had got together the night before, and they all came with me on the boat to keep me company for the first few miles. When we got off the boat at Senju, however, the thought of the 3,000 miles before me suddenly filled my heart, and neither the houses of the town nor the faces of my friends could be seen by my tearful eyes except as a vision. So we get that nice prose, and this is where he's moving in the internal. He's exploring his own feelings and how he feels about what's going to be this colossal um, journey, right? And then he springboards into the haiku. The passing spring, birds mourn, fishes weep with tearful eyes. All right, so now he's exploring the external, right? He's explored the internal through the prose paragraph that sets up the haibun, and then he's exploring the external landscape when he accesses the haiku, the passing spring, birds mourn, fishes weep with tearful eyes. And it's interesting blending, right? Because he's blending the images of the external world with what he feels internally. And we know what he feels internally because he tells us in the opening paragraph of that haibun. Okay, so here we have a haibun I had written about my experience. I wrote it as part of my poetry collection about my experience in Iraq when I was in the Iraq War in 2003 and 2004. So I'm following the same tradition with regard to Basho and even other Japanese haiku and haibun writers, where I set it up with a prose paragraph and then I springboard into in this case, I am sticking to the rhyme scheme of a haiku, the 575 syllabic scheme. So I think all the information you really need is who Isa is. I mentioned Isa. He's a Japanese poet. So Kobayashi Isa was a Japanese poet and lay Buddhist priest of the Jodo Shinshu. He is known for his haiku poems and journals. He is better known as simply Isa, a pen name meaning cup of tea. He is regarded as one of the 4 haiku masters in Japan, along with Basho, Busan, and Shiki. And they're also regarded as the Great Four. So I'll just go ahead and read this aloud and we'll explore what it's doing. How's it exploring the internal versus the external? War haibun. It is another land out here, a lunarscape of endless hector. The hot wires of daydream burning the morning air, open to the elegy of affixed bayonets, weapons alert to the dirt. We are estranged to our own ruins. Isa would write home, an island of contemplation, his native tongues pulsing against rice straw paper at the death of his last son. Outliving them, he would pine, outliving them all. But there was a silent loss to life, he might have later etched, living his waning nights assembling the words, asleep in a shed, the black scourge of time white-knuckling at its door. And now the haiku half of the haibun. Metal rattling, war machine sifts through sand ore, cup of tea pouring. So something else that the haibun does in its 2 parts, right? These 2 components, the prose paragraph and the haiku part of it, is the tension that exists. If you remember in the elements of poetry, we talk about conflict or tension, especially with regard to images. So we get this sort of this landscape, this external world being sort of explored in the paragraph, and then the idea of what that exactly means to the harder, more conflicting images of metal rattling, this war machine sifts through sand, and what is that? The idea of a cup of tea pouring and mixing that with war imagery, right? That tension that exists between that and then the paragraph as well. So the haibun is a very effective sort of way of exploring poetic tension because you're getting the prose paragraph and then of course you're getting the counterpart to that, and that is the haiku. So besides haiku and besides haibun, another poetic form that Basho explores in his collection of poetry is the idea of renga. So Renga, and that's collaborative poetry. It reminds me of, and when we say collaborative poetry, it means poets, more than one poet, sitting down and exchanging and riffing off each other. So one would write a haiku, the other one would write the next haiku, and all these haikus combined become what's called a renga, this collaborative poem. So it reminds me when I was in graduate school, I read this book called Your Father on a Train of Ghosts, and I'm just reading right here from Goodreads. Your Father on the Train of Ghosts is one of the most extensive collaborations in American poetry. Over the course of a year, acclaimed poets G.C. Waltrip and John Gallagher wrote poems back and forth, sometimes once or twice a week, sometimes 5 or 6 a day. As the collaboration deepened, a third voice emerged that neither poet can claim as solely their own. So that would be interesting to explore as these individuals in Basho's collection sit down to write the renga, this collaborative poem. How does a third voice that they didn't that neither of the poets intended to have. How does that emerge? Or how does many voices, what we call polyphonic, how does that emerge? The polyphonic idea. So just reading what renga is. Renga, more detailed, is a linked verse. It's a genre of Japanese collaborative poetry in which alternating stanzas, or ku, of 575 uh, sound units, not to be confused with syllables that we talked about before, per line, are linked in succession by multiple poets. Um, so yeah, that this is exactly what we see here with Waltrip and Gallagher. But the one I'm going to read to you within the book, and I'm just going to read it aloud again, is on page. I'm going to start with the end of page 67, but also it bleeds over to the actual renga, bleeds over to page 68 in the book, in our collection of poetry. So just to set it up, what the scene is, we see that these individuals are sitting in silence, watching moonlight, trying to penetrate the clouds and listening. I'm just reading directly from the text, to the sound of the lingering rain. It was really regrettable that I had come such a long way only to look at the dark shadow of the moon, but I consoled myself by remembering the famous lady who had returned without composing a single poem from the long walk she had. Now I'm on page 68. Taken to hear a cuckoo. The following are the poems we composed on that occasion. So these Japanese poets sat down with Basho. They sat maybe in a ring, and then each one by one, each poet constructed their own haiku to form the greater sort of idea of a renga. So we get the first one written by the priest. Um, Regardless of weather, the moon shines the same. It is the drifting clouds that make it seem different on different nights. And then one written by another poet, Tosoi. Swift the moon across the sky, treetops below dripping with rain. And then Tosoi continues, having slept in a temple, I watched the moon with a solemn look. And then it shifts to another poet who's present for this renga named Sora. Having slept in the rain, the bamboo corrected itself to view the moon. And then we shift to another poet, Soha. How lonely it is to look at the moon, hearing a temple, eavesdrop patterns. So yeah, so we get a lot of this moonscape, right? This idea, and they're entering this idea of nature. And of course, the moon, the satellite that next to the Earth, is of course part of our nature. And they're also accessing the rain, the idea of this moment in time and this weather pattern that's taking place. And they're smashing all those together, all these haikus together, to form what would become the renga, this collaborative poetic form. Okay, so today we explored haiku, which really is the attestation of nature, right? In the 575 syllabic scheme that sometimes breaks away from that 575 syllabic scheme, and that's okay. It's for two reasons we said. Number one, there's a modern haiku that tries to stick to that sort of framework, but doesn't, but in a loose sort of way. But also that in the narrow road to the deep north, this is translation poetry, so it doesn't. The 575 syllabic scheme doesn't always translate. We looked at haibun, which is the combination of a haiku and then that prose paragraph that starts off in the haibun, right? Then it springboards into the haiku and explores. You remember it explores the external and the internal landscapes. And of course, we looked at renga, which is collaborative poetry made up of many haikus. So next class, we're going to look at tanka and waka, which are two other Japanese poetic forms. But until then, if you have any questions or concerns or areas of clarification, please email me and I'll be sure to get back to you probably within the hour. Thanks, guys. Talk to you later. Bye.